Welcome to Chebacco Chats, Season 4, Episode 5. I'm Jenna Jandreau, Communications and Engagement Manager at MDI Historical Society, and your host today. Season 4 of Chebacco Chats is sponsored by Machias Savings Bank. We are grateful for their continued support of our exhibits and programs. Chebacco Chats uses a webinar format, so while you can see and hear us, we cannot see and hear our audience. We do invite you to ask questions and send comments using the chat feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Feel free to use the chat to reach out to us or to other audience members. Today, I'm speaking to Julia Gray about Cranberry Isles during the Age of Sail, the topic of her article in our upcoming Chebacco, the Maritime Edition. Julia has worked in museums for more than 20 years and currently leads the Wilson Museum in Castine as their executive director. Her background in archaeology and anthropology drew her initially into roles in collections and exhibits at the Peary-MacMillan Arctic Museum and the Abbe Museum. After leaving the Abbe Museum in 2017, she ran her own consulting business working with museums, land trusts, and other organizations across Maine. She is a graduate of Bowdoin College and the University of Arkansas. Julia lives in Orland with her husband and 2 dogs. So thank you for being here, Julia.
Thank you for having me, Jenna.
I am going to start off our chat by asking what the origin story is behind your article in the upcoming edition of Chebacco.
Sure. Well, there's at least one audience member on here. I saw Roz is on here. So Roz knows the origin story of this. So after I left the Abbe Museum and was working doing consulting work, I connected with the Friends of the Islesford Historical Museum, who Roz had worked with for a number of years. And Roz keeps trying to retire. Maybe she will eventually. And I took over working with them, and we worked to create this exhibit to feature a significant storyline in the history of the Cranberry Isles. And it was a great learning experience for me, along with the rest of the team, because it was pretty new to me. Again, having been at the Abbey for so long and focused on that, this was definitely different.
So why don't we talk a little bit about what your article is about? We have a slideshow with some images from the article, but then a few that we weren't able to include because of space. So while I share my screen, why don't you launch into your topic?
Sure. So again, kind of a pared down version of the exhibit, which I believe will still be up for at least another season out on Islesford. So if you want the whole story, you can take a trip out once the weather improves and the museum opens, was to kind of do a pretty high level overview with some kind of vignettes of very particular stories that introduce folks to a story that is in some ways very particular to the Cranberry Isles, but is also very has applicability across kind of Maine's coastal island and other coastal communities during that kind of the majority of the 19th century. And so we look at the kind of the 3 big buckets of the maritime economy. We look at maritime trade, we look at fishing, and we look at boat building, with a couple of side stories into thinking about the risk part of the equation of risk and reward. You know, what were the dangers and hazards of going to sea, and what impacts did those have on the community, and the historical kind of some of the big historical stories that were happening kind of parallel to these maritime economic trends and changes and so on. And it was interesting to use kind of look at what is a very big story and applies really across Maine, but to look at it from a very specific lens of the Cranberry Isles, and to a certain extent the Great Harbor. There was certainly some conversations throughout about how certainly at that time in reality the Cranberry Isles were really part of a larger ecosystem, kind of economic ecosystem around the Great Harbor.
So for those who might not be familiar with the Cranberry Isles area, I did a selection of a map that's the 1887 Hobie and Stewart map, and this is courtesy of the Library of Congress. And I zoomed in on the bottom portion of MDI and then the Cranberry Isles region. So could you talk me through a little bit what some of these islands are?
Sure. So as we look at this map again, this is cool because it does show the Great Harbor, kind of that water area in the middle, surrounded by the pink and the green and the purple around it. That's our Great Harbor. The Cranberry Isles are 5 islands. Great Cranberry, which is the big. So they may look purple on your screen. They're the middle of the screen. So the largest of the group of 5 islands is Great Cranberry. The one just to the east of it, or the right, is Little Cranberry or Islesford. And then you have Sutton, Baker, and Bear, which are 3 smaller islands. So Sutton Island up at the top, and then Baker and Bear as you head out towards sea. With the majority of the settlement being on Cranberry and Little Cranberry, Great Cranberry, Little Cranberry, but certainly there have been people on Sutton and Baker. I actually don't know if Bear Island has ever been inhabited or not. I'm sure there are folks in the audience that know more about that than I do. One of the things that I think is really cool also about, I mean, in general, these late 1800s maps that show like and you can zoom, if you go on Library of Congress, you can zoom right in, you can see each of the names that goes with each of these little squares. It shows you that in 1887, Cranberry Isles was a busy place with lots of households, lots of businesses. There was a lot going on. So I think that's one of the other neat features of this map. And there is a lighthouse on Baker Island as well. So, and then there's other lighthouses in the area.
Yes, and if you are able to, when you zoom in, you can also see the life-saving service station.
Yes, right. Yep. Right.
Yep.
Yep.
So it's fascinating. Again, Library of Congress. We can put the link in the show notes for this episode because it's really fun to click around and look at that.
Yeah.
And so you also provided another map to me, and I complimented it with a quote from your article, which is, during a time when the primary mode of transportation from one coastal Maine community to another was by sea, these islands were on the superhighway, not a place apart. And I put the full map, and then our next slide, I showed a selection of just our little portion to kind of like show the overview and then bring it in a little bit closer to home. So what are we looking at here?
So we're looking at an absolute treasure of a map that is part of the Cranberry Historical Society, Peary Island Historical Society, that was the navigational map used by Carrie Richardson, who was the navigator on her namesake ship, the Carrie Richardson, that was captained by her husband. And it actually has plotted on it you can go to the historical site and see it, and you can see, but you're seeing some of these marks and lines. You see the lines going across the North Atlantic and other places. These are her actually plotting their routes, both across the Atlantic and in the coasting trade all the way down. And this wonderfully includes the entire East Coast down to the Caribbean, Mexico, the northern part of South America. And it really shows kind of the operational theater of sorts of the maritime trade, and then as well the fishing grounds that were the lifeblood of the Cranberry Isles maritime fleet for so long. So I think it's neat how it really gives you the scale of the space that was happening. And the whole story of Carrie Richardson and the vessel are wonderful. And the Great Cranberry Historical Society has a online exhibit that you can check that out. But that's what this shows. Yep.
So with transatlantic voyages, like we see charted here, or some of these coasting expeditions, what was going on with these expeditions? What were they doing exactly? What were they transporting?
Sure.
What were they up to?
So noting that my knowledge is really particularly focused in this instance on the Cranberry Isles, but I think does apply more widely, around MDI and the coast of Maine. The bulk of what was being transported across the Atlantic from North America to Europe was actually fish, salt cod, probably some other things as well, but a huge bulk of it was salt cod that was being harvested up in the Grand Banks, Gulf of St. Lawrence, et cetera, and then being transported to Europe in large part to meet a demand. Their stocks had been exhausted, to meet a demand that Catholic Europe needed to have fish on the days they could only eat fish. So that was Maine's really important marketplace. And I think, the Northeast really important marketplace for salt cod.
This would be tomorrow.
This would be tomorrow. Yep.
This would be tomorrow, Friday. I believe it's between Ash Wednesday and Easter. That is the typical
Yeah.
not typical, is the period of time.
Yeah. For every Friday, and then all the various high holy holidays for the Catholic Church, you needed to fish if you were going to get your protein. So that was really important. And then they would bring back from Europe. Two of the key things they brought back from Europe on Cranberry Isles vessels was salt, because they needed the salt to salt the cod that they would then bring back. So that was kind of an interesting cycle. And then there's citrus seemed to be a popular item from a lot of these trips were going to Portugal. And that seemed to be a key port destination for Cranberry Isles vessels. And they were bringing back citrus. Although in at least one of the better documented stories, the citrus came back to Marblehead, Mass, and then was sold, and then the money was brought back to the Cranberry Isles. So the coasting trade, which is something I really like, I'd heard of transatlantic voyages like that, there's kind of a mythology of that in Maine, but until I did the work for this exhibit and then the following up article, the coasting trade was not something I was familiar with, but came to really understand it as kind of the trucking of the 19th century. This was how you got your goods from point to point. You would load up with something in Maine, and then you'd stop in Boston, and then you'd stop in New York. And each port you would offload some, take on some. So that was your delivery system to move things up and down the coast. And it would often be months that a vessel from the Cranberry Isles or other parts of down east would be port hopping all along the East Coast. And again, well down into the Caribbean. They do New Orleans, they do Cuba, they do Turks and Caicos seem to be popular destinations for a period of time. We know they were in South America, Northern South America. So that was, and again, it was very much that, pick up, drop off, pick up, drop off. And there's a fascinating array of different types of documentation that kind of tell us when and how and who and what was happening in the coasting trade.
Okay, so let's switch to the next slide. Now, the fish drying here on Little Cranberry Island, is this kind of an overlap of the fishing that was happening, but also the transatlantic or what you were just talking about?
Yeah.
Okay,
So
great.
yeah. So and certainly one of the things that is most resonant when thinking about the story of the Cranberry Isles, and like I keep saying this, but many Maine coastal communities, was that fishing was really significant then, and it remains really significant. It's just a different species now, right? But yes, I mean, the fish was, and oftentimes it was the same vessel. So these smaller schooners or other, similar vessels, brigs and brigantines, 1 to 2 mostly masted sailing vessels, would spend part of their year fishing sometimes and part of the year coasting. And it was often the fish that was a key part of what they were taking out of Maine and trading either to Europe, because the Catholic population of Europe needed fish, or in addition, the salt cod was an important food source that plantation owners were using to feed enslaved people that were doing labor on their plantations. And then as Catholic immigrant populations increased along the eastern seaboard, Irish and Italian and so on, they needed more fish, and salt cod was an important part of that as well. So they were very much intertwined, and there are a variety of accounts of the extent of the kind of fishing industry on Cranberry Isles, which, as we know today, really continues. And when you read these historical documents, it's the same names, it's the same people. So one of the families that certainly pops up a lot in talking about 19th century maritime economy in Cranberry Isles is the Hadlocks, and there are still Hadlocks lobster fishing on the Cranberry Isles. Stanley's, I mean, there's a, if there's a name that you hear widely in the Cranberry Isles, they were doing this in the 19th century, and for the most part, many of those families are still doing it today. And it sustains, I mean, it's such an important economic thing, lobster fishing on the Cranberry Isles today.
And during your research for the exhibit and the article, you stumbled across some documents and objects that you said you found particularly interesting, and one is exhibited here. So tell me about this a little bit.
So again, this being a really new thing to me, and I'd go into the archives at Acadia, and Marie Yarbrough would pull things for me, and sometimes we'd be trying to figure out what they were, and it took us a little bit to figure out what these were, doing some searches and talking to some folks. But it's wonderful when you find an unexpected primary source, right? Like, you're thinking, I'm going to find ship's logs, I'm going to find journals. And this was a really neat, unexpected primary source. I was just thinking, though, as I was prepping, that there's one little thing I wish was different about these documents than is. So these are cod bounty receipts. So for a huge chunk of the cod fishery from like the 1830s to the 1860s, and some even earlier. While it seems like it was really lucrative economically, it actually wasn't quite enough. And so the US government was subsidizing the cod fishery by paying bounties to vessels for cod fishing. And there's a whole folder of these in the archives at Acadia National Park for a couple of different years. This happens to be 1862, and they're paying for the previous year's fishing. And you see in it, you see the names of the vessels, the captains, how big they are. They're listed by tonnage, which was a volume measurement, not a weight measurement, as some folks will know. And it gave you this neat cross section of who was fishing cod. What I wish, because the bounties were based on the size of the vessel and not how much cod they brought in. So in terms of thinking about, some of the ways we're starting to understand environmental change and climate change and species, the impact of humans on species through historical documents, it would be definitely more useful to have how much cod they caught, but instead we know what size vessels and that they were in the cod fishery. And it also, I think, kind of extends the name, the understanding of the fact that government support of our economy goes back a couple of centuries and is not something new, that bounties to keep industries that were probably no longer sustainable going have a fairly deep history. Yes, it is, Carl, it is Clear the Track.
Yeah, that's the name of the vessel, Clear the Track. So something I noticed on this, Julia, it's signed by Gilbert Hadlock. And
that's one of your guys.
Yeah, in research for history of the life-saving service station, Gilbert and his brother were they sold the land for the life-saving service station to be built on, and then Gilbert was its first keeper. And I looked at this probably 3 times and didn't even notice that he had signed it on the bottom. So this is 1862, and that life-saving service station was, I think, 1878. So this was before that time.
Yep.
So we've covered a little bit, very briefly, the transatlantic voyages, coasting, some of the fishing, but one of the other industries that you go into a little bit in your article is shipbuilding. And we have here a great image from the MDI Historical Society's collection of a brig that's under construction in Soames Cove around 1905. We are talking about the Cranberry Isles, though, so I would love to hear a little bit about why this is the image that appeared in your article.
Sure. So we know that there were at least a couple of dozen vessels documented in like Ralph Stanley's listed vessels from the Cranberry Isles. His kind of the authority on vessels owned and where they were built and so on. But I think primarily because of the timeline of when a lot of those were built, and just the reality of who was taking pictures of what, we don't have images of any of these vessels being constructed on the Cranberry Isles. So that was one of the reasons for working with this image. But the other was that there was around the Great Harbor and around down East Maine, vessels were being built in one place and owned in one place and captained in one place. So there were certainly plenty of folks, boat owners, captains in the Cranberry Isles whose boats were being built in Mount Desert or Tremont or Eden, or further away. Sometimes they were ending up from the North Shore of Massachusetts and so on, or Cherryfield or things like that. So there was a lot of sources of building vessels that were not just the Cranberry Isles. And I expect that just because of the size of the islands and their population, that a lot of the vessels being built there were smaller ones, and probably not the ones that people thought worth investing in taking pictures of as much. But that's kind of neat. And one of the other things that Jen and I talked a little bit about that I think is neat when you look at these. Yeah. So not only were the vessels built in different places, but they were often owned by 5 to a dozen different investors, basically, and oftentimes it was between those communities. So there'd be a vessel that was owned by a couple people from Cranberry Isle, a couple from Tremont, a couple from Eden. So there was the ownership of these vessels was also spread across these communities, and the people, I mean, they were related. So there's Hadlocks in Southwest Harbor, there's Hadlocks on Cranberry Isle. So none of these places existed or functioned in isolation, throughout the 19th and early 20th century.
So, and I wonder, how long they had to stand there? I know in early, camera days, there was a moment of, and if there's someone off, like, no, you're not done, you're not done, wait, wait, wait.
Yep, yep,
And then it hails that they can all like go back to work or something, like the photo is over.
yep.
So we can kind of assume some of the reward, although you do go into that in your article about these industries, the livelihoods, but what was some of the risk of some of these
Yeah.
industries? What was at stake
I mean,
here?
life at sea was dangerous then. It continues to be dangerous now. Lobster, Maine's fishermen continue to be lost at sea. There was just today I saw in the news, there was a shellfish digger who drowned off of the mid coast. So that's always been dangerous. I think probably some of the most emotional kind of like impactful stories that I encountered in the history from Cranberry Isles are happen to be around the Hadlock family. Samuel Hadlock Sr. and his wife Sarah lost 5 out of their 6 sons at sea, and 2 of them they're both at sea or while sailing. And there's 2 very different stories. One that's sad but not terribly dramatic, and one that's very dramatic and cinema worthy. They lost one son who died of disease, probably something like yellow fever, when his vessel put into port at in Cuba during a coasting trade voyage. That was one of the Hadlocks, and then Samuel Hadlock Jr.'s story is probably the one that deserves a film at some point, where Hadlock Jr., his eldest son, and a local crew of about 14 men and boys sailed to Greenland to harvest fish, but also to capture Arctic animals that he would then stuff and sell in Europe. That was that connected to another Hadlock story we'll talk about a little bit later. And Samuel Hadlock Jr. went out to hunt for seals and polar bears and like that, and didn't come back. And they waited for a while, and he didn't come back. So the ship sailed, and then the ship disappeared, and it was never seen again. So he died. He never showed back to the ship, and then the ship was lost at sea somewhere, and the whole crew of local folks never made it back. And then at some point later, the stories that were reported back was that a group of Inuit hunters found Samuel Hadlock frozen to death, perhaps in hunting position, but probably a reaction to freezing to death position, on the ice in the Baffin Bay, either Labrador or Greenland. But so and the rest of the crew, no idea where they ended up. But a loss like that was 14 local folks in a population that was not particularly large at that time. So I can just imagine the impact that might have. And then that also ties into the life-saving station stories and the establishment of the Coast Guard. And there's a wonderful picture, or a series of images, but Jenna has one picture of what we're pretty sure was a less tragic shipwreck. This was the Don Parsons. This was early 20th century, and this was a schooner that was bringing coal, transporting a load of coal during, I think it was about 1920, and it wrecked on the Cranberry Isles. And the local population was very eager to assist with the salvage of that coal for repurposing as use of a heat source in their households. So the coal got cleaned up fairly effectively from the wreck of the Don Parsons. However, the owners of that cargo probably did not get much of the coal back. And there's accounts of pretty intense response to make sure that the coal got put to good use.
Absolutely. And there was also, it was reported in the Bar Harbor Times that week, I believe, that there were 2 schooners that wrecked within 24 hours. And I believe there were no lost lives. So that just goes to show the excellent training and courage of the men that were serving at the U.S. Life-Saving Service Station.
Yep.
And I had also read that was a year, as you were saying, they very effectively salvaged the coal quickly and efficiently. Not only people from the Cranberry Isles did so, but there were some MDI men who came over with their skills and boats and brought some to MDI as well. And it was a year where coal was extremely expensive. And it was, they were essentially trying to, you know, stretch the supply that they had. So it almost seems like this something out of a movie, that in this horrible storm, like after this horrible storm, no lives lost. The next morning, there's just tons and tons of coal. And there's a picture in, if you were to access the digital archives and search Don Parsons, you would see a picture of the coal on the rocks. So I would encourage people to go check that out.
Yeah.
So in addition to this photo, we have this one here that's not included in your article or mine about the life-saving station. So it's a great image that you should soak your eyes on now, because it's the only opportunity that we're going to make it available here. But it is the U.S. Life-Saving Service Station out on Islesford. I do see a woman in the background wearing a hat with a glorious like scarf coming off the back of it, and some men sitting on the lifeboat. So they were tasked essentially with saving lives, and less so for livelihoods. But Mainers, as you talk about in your article, were known for having really great navigational skills and were good at the job. So I imagine that Cranberry Isles was no exception to that.
Yep.
And that they had a good reputation for the work at hand.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to fit all of the great history that we come across in our word counts in the container that is the article. So what was something that you would love to give a little bit of airtime to that you weren't able to fit into the article?
So I think there were a couple of things. I actually added something, Jenna, so I'm popping this one on, Jenna. One of the really fascinating stories to me in thinking about the broader context of Maine history especially is the significance of the coasting trade to Maine statehood. So there's a really, really strong tie between the coasting trade and Maine statehood. And that is that when in the late 1700s, there was the law was established for maritime trade along the coast of the new colonies, that you had to stop at customs and have and do customs paperwork and pay customs fees every time you went to a state that you did not border. So if you crossed a state line, you had to pay customs. Well, until 1820, Maine was part of Massachusetts. So Cranberry Isles and other coastal Maine coasting trade vessels didn't have to deal with customs until they passed from New York to New Jersey, because Massachusetts between Massachusetts colony and the province of Maine, they bordered all of those states. And so in the repeated votes for statehood, the vast majority of Maine's coastal fishing communities and trade, maritime communities voted against statehood because they didn't want to have to pay extra customs duties and do extra customs paperwork. And so it was a change in 1819 of the coasting trade duties law that then tipped the scales for the statehood votes in Maine. And you see a significant shift between the second to last and the last statehood vote in the coastal communities because of that change in coasting trade. Think about all of the states that Massachusetts borders that Maine doesn't. So that was a kind of an interesting piece in the broader context. And then just the wider story of the Hadlocks, and especially Samuel Hadlock's fascinating story. And this is a shout out for the book group if you're not already doing the book group or haven't explored God's Pocket, Rachel Field's piece, is the fascinating and difficult and story we're still working to really understand of Samuel Hadlock essentially kidnapping an Inuit family and taking them to Europe as performers and traveling them around doing, with his menagerie of stuffed Arctic animals, doing kayak demonstrations and so on. And the kind of ongoing work to understand that whole story, which didn't make it into the article and actually didn't make it into the exhibit either. But there's Great Cranberry Island Historical Society has done some work around that. There's a researcher in Europe that's been doing that in addition to what Rachel Field has written up. And I will drop in the chat in a minute because it's by far the easiest way to find it, to have the link. Samuel Hadlock had two journals that he did. He had one from 1822 to 1823 when he was in Ireland, Wales, and England. And this is probably where we know it is. It's where when the entire Inuit family except for the father died, and he brought in Romney, which we would have known referred previously as Gypsy family, in substitute, thinking that people wouldn't notice that these were not Inuit. These were in fact Romney folks. And he actually got driven out of England because they found out he was a fraud, made it to Europe. And then there's another journal from 1824 to 1826 of his European journeys. They say almost nothing about this Inuit family and what befell them, and just very slight references to it. The journals are quite a trip because he has like a history of the universe and history of the world, and a lot of it's very travelogish. But I also want to do another huge shout out to Maureen Fournier, who is our MDI's greatest transcriber of handwritten material. She did the transcriptions of the Champlain Society logbooks, and much more of a challenge, I think, the Hadlock Journal. She did the transcriptions of those, which are before standardized spelling and grammar, and plus their European place names and European royalty names and all these things. So it was quite a fun adventure. But that whole story of, and it's why the Minerva and Samuel Hadlock Jr. were in Greenland, was because he was looking to get more Arctic animals to take to Europe and sell and trade. So there's some really good resources on that. And yes, and Gail, who knows this really well, is also adding some great references in the chat. And I will.
So I'm going to refer to the chat now because we have some questions from a little bit earlier when we were talking about the cod. I believe it was the cod subsidies and the Clear the Track vessel. We have a comment about how the name itself, Clear the Track, is historically significant. Does it refer to the growth of railways locally? Fascinations with that new technology. That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Way to frame the naming of the boat. So if anybody has any answers to that, please throw them in the chat or ideas about that. Julia, what do you think?
So I don't know enough about railroads history of timing in Maine. So that was 1862 that bounty was written. So I don't know how it related. I don't know if it's, I just actually learned today, that term we use, buttload, like it sounds like that's some like young teenager slang thing. Apparently a buttload is actually 2 hogshead barrels worth. So, Clear the Track may also have some other meaning that I'm not aware of, in kind of maritime lingo, but I think that's a thing to think about.
Another question is, would the citrus loaded in Portugal be for the crew to avoid scurvy?
They probably would have used some of it, but they sold it. He was able to sell a pretty substantial amount of citrus on the North Shore in Massachusetts for money that was then used to come back and have another ship built. So I think they probably would have helped that they could have had some of it on the way, but it was also a cash item on the trip, because everybody, you couldn't get it locally, right?
That's why we hear of individuals getting citrus fruits for Christmas. We kind of scoff at that now, when in reality that was actually very, very valuable when it was received. So we also had a comment from Gail about the Don Parsons was wrecked right next to the life-saving service station, which I'm sure was extremely helpful when they were doing rescue mission, if they were close by. We have a comment from Ronald Epp. Your transatlantic references suggest that you may have used David Hackett Fisher's monumental Champlain's Dream. Have you found support for Champlain's claim that in the early 17th century, between 800 and 1,000 French vessels were annually engaged in the North American cod fisheries every year? Surely some of this activity must have been off MDI, correct?
That's a good question, Ron. I actually didn't particularly use that source. I was using ship's logs and so on from the Cranberry Isles, because the first cod fishing, the first vessel kind of owned off the Cranberry Isles was Samuel Hadlock Sr.'s schooner Ocean, and in 1807 it went to the Great Banks and harvested a load of cod, salted it, and took it to Europe. So 1807 was the kind of the earliest off of the Cranberry Isles, and I was pretty much focused on that. And so, but prior to that, certainly between, in the earlier period, there's there are strong feelings that there was certainly a Basque presence around MDI and Frenchman Bay. There's been Basque archaeologists that have spent time trying to like find additional evidence other than what's in the accounts that they kind of have on their side of the ocean that Basque fishermen were in this area. There's some place names that may be Basque related. My kind of like, you know, very unacademic kind of thinking around it is that for the first probably several decades, if not 100 years of European fishermen harvesting cod in the North Atlantic, they avoided documentation of it because they wanted to keep that resource to themselves. Because that's been that, you know, in working with the Basque researchers and the Basque archaeologists, that's kind of they're thinking, you know, they found a jackpot, and so they're kind of ambiguous about where exactly it was that they found these fishing banks were. So I think there's a pretty good chunk of time, and I think probably some of the material culture changes that we see or adoptions that we see among Wabanaki folks suggest that there were European fishermen here before like the supposed first context of that we haven't, you know, documented transatlantic voyages. I think there were definitely fishermen working over here, and they would have their shore bases would have been pretty ephemeral. I mean, Red Bay up in Labrador is one of the more substantial ones, but I think a lot of them would have been very ephemeral and hard to kind of document if they weren't writing it down.
We have a comment from Carl Little saying Edward Hopper would have loved the Islesford Life-Saving Station if only he traveled beyond Rockland. I agree.
Well, now that we have AI, Carl, we could have some AI thing create an Edward Hopper out of that photograph, right? Gosh, no.
I saw today actually AI generated selfies from different historical periods, and my husband showed it to me, and I was like, please, I'm purposely trying to avoid all of this. I don't want to see it. And it was surreal. It was like gladiators, like gladiator competitors, what they would look like
Yep.
with selfies, you know, cavemen, prehistoric cavemen. It was hard not to chuckle at those.
Yeah.
So I agree with that for sure. And also the life-saving station was apparently or reportedly red and then yellow, had a red tower and yellow, and then it was painted all white. So it had a couple of iterations there before it moved over to MDI. So another question, when did they start building friendship sloops on Little Cranberry?
I do not know the answer to that, Jeff and Orlinda. Because I was focused on kind of that maritime trade and period of sail, I was working with Ralph Stanley's list, which didn't include smaller vessels like that for the most part. I expect that's why we have a very underrepresented idea of the quantity of vessels that were built on Cranberry Isles. I think a lot of them were kind of friendship sloop size, local fishing or fishing in Gulf of St. Lawrence, that kind of thing. And so there may be other folks that have documentation of that, although if Ralph Stanley didn't have it, I'm not sure where else it might be. And Gail might Gail's on here, so Gail Granch is on here. So if she's encountered information about that, feel free to chime in.
If she did throw in a reference to Beyond God's Pocket, which also has additional information about Samuel Hadlock's journey. So our April 24 book club, MDI History's book club, is featuring God's Pocket by Rachel Field. So do read Beyond God's Pocket as well. But we're also welcoming Robin Clifford Wood as a special guest, and she wrote The Field House, which was it's a memoir and kind of biography of Rachel Field hybrid, which is excellent. I'm reading it right now. And so she'll be joining us and talking a little bit about what it was like to buy Rachel Field's summer home out on Sutton Island and to learn about her and also Hadlock's story. And she'll be sharing great photographs with us from her research, such as Rachel Field dressing up as Samuel Hadlock and in costume on a porch out on her place on Sutton. So Carl Little, I'm moving through the comments here. Carl Little said the U.S. Life-Saving Service had the saddest motto: you have to go out, but you don't have to come back. And that's like, wow. I do remember listening to oral histories where some of the Coast Guardsmen said there were many times that they didn't think that they were going to come back when they were out on rescue missions.
There's an incredible multimedia exhibit experience at Mystic Seaport of their, because they have a life-saving station as one of the many structures at Mystic Seaport, and you go into the space and they've created audio, and they've got, you're looking at the boat, and you hear the audio and the creaking of lines and the boat going out and the hollering, and as they're going out to this vessel. It's a pretty neat way to do it. So if you're in Mystic Seaport and you want to know, kind of get that sense.
I just copied your links into the chat to everyone, Julia. So these are the two.
I didn't put them to everyone.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
It was the two links are for the Hadlock journals. We have one for 1824 to 26. Everyone should be able to click on that. And then the Hadlock Journal 1822 to 23. And there's a link for that. And we have somebody asking for the link to the Library of Congress. So Julia, I'm going to pull that up and add that to the
There's a
chat.
The Library of Congress has a wonderful selection of MDI maps, and they're super. You can download really high, full size resolution to print if you want. They're free because it's Library of Congress. You can zoom way in on them. It's a really wonderful collection. So once you get to that one, then you can probably search out from there and see some of the other really cool maps of MDI that are on there and all kinds of other places.
They have on the Library of Congress a spot where it says different sizes. And so you can see something in a JPEG size that might look good, say on your computer, but you can also download them in large files. Yeah. So if you do want to get that really fine look, just keep increasing the size that you download it at and see if that helps out.
Yep.
And Carl says, just read that motto was unofficial. You don't have to go out. You have to go out, but you don't have to come back.
Yep.
Sometimes these unofficial mottos are just as important as the official ones when it comes to how seriously they take them.
In my other life as a volunteer firefighter, I did get to be transported by one of the current U.S. Coast Guard vessels out of Southwest Harbor and their crew out to Islesford for a Hancock County Firefighters Association meeting. So I've actually had that extra experience of the Coast Guard taking me to Islesford, which was different from taking the Beal and Bunker to Islesford for most of my trips.
In the history of the life-saving service article in Chebacco, I talk that it kind of concludes with how they're still saving lives and still rescuing boats and hauling in boats and all these things. But like you can read about what they're doing a lot of times on their Facebook page. Like it's very public, and then you can also see images of them doing yoga on the pier on a sunny day, and then a field trip for local students on what it's like at the Coast Guard station. And it's just an interesting thing that one of our historical resources now is a Facebook post versus, a COD subsidy. Very different.
Yep.
So I think those are all the comments and questions. Julia, did you have anything that you wanted to wrap up with before I sign us off for the evening?
I would just, I'd love to, a lot of the folks that are on here are part of my kind of circle of friends and acquaintances from MDI. And I'd love to also invite all of you over to Castine starting May 27th when the Wilson Museum opens up to check out the Wilson Museum, which also has some cool local maritime stuff, including your opportunity during peak season to help make a small wooden boat. You can check out and you can stop by the Castine Historical Society and pick up the book. The exhibit is done by Castine Historical Society. Did a wonderful exhibit about this same time period in Castine. And one of the things that I noted, Islesford is, and it was on the smaller scale of things. They did transatlantic and coasting trade and you think the great big, square rigged vessels and so on. Those are coming out of Castine. So you can check out that at the Castine Historical Society as well. So make a trip either up and around and down and over, or if you have water transportation, it's a little bit more direct. So come on over.
Just go. It's just a little hop skip.
Just a hop skip.
Little hop skip. Well, thanks so much for being here, Julia. This was really awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for a great audience and the questions and the comments.
It says there's a program on Islesford to teach kids boat building. Yes. Islesford Boat Works. A great comment from Gail. Yep. Thank you.
And in the article, when you get your if your membership is up and you get your, it does talk about current boat building in the Cranberry Isles, and it does talk about the boat works as keeping that skill alive, which is really wonderful.
Awesome. Ralph Stanley would be very happy.
Yes.
So coming up next week on Chebacco Chats, Thursday, April 6th at 4:30 p.m., we will be ushering in National Poetry Month with poet Carl Little, who will read and chat about a selection of place-based poetry of MDI from a variety of poets, both contemporary and historic, such as Candace Stover, Christian Barter, Eleanor Wiley, Hortense Flexner, and more. This includes a poem from myself and also some by Carl Little. Chebacco Chats are available to view on our website the week after they air. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel at MDI History to be notified when we upload them. We are currently seeking feedback on this web series, so please visit our Chebacco Chats page and take a survey. It's just a few minutes and we would really appreciate it. The new Chebacco is currently in production and will be delivered to members' mailboxes in late April. You can become a member or renew your membership by visiting our website, mdihistory.org/membership. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Night, everyone.